obviously, that's why I have to have notes. She was involved in so much, it's just unreal. In this case, childcare, and I want to emphasize that I think part of this was the fact that her only natural child died at 3 in Montreal of cholera. And so I kind of discussed that she actually helped found the Child Saving Institute, and I'll have to put on my glasses, I guess, because I can't see this. The Hattie B. Monroe Home for Handicapped Children, and then she entertained children at the castle, and at that time is when she saw Violet Carl, who was an orphan, we believe. Anyway, they adopted Violet Carl, and then went from there. And then, of course, she was always interested in education, and of course she would be too, because she helped establish University of Omaha down on Reddick Street, and also donated land at 13th and Farnham, which could be used as rental property and have income for the university. And the last contribution, there were many before, was $50,000, which is now $200,000, which she gave in her will to the university. She also supported a place called Piney Woods School in Jackson, Mississippi, for all black students, all black youth. During World War II, she opened up the game room downstairs in the castle for all enlisted men in the service and provided entertainment and transportation for them. And she supported the Liberty Loan Drive. World War I. Money for the Liberty Loan Program, and for the relief program in Europe, and also for the disabled veterans. And then she was also into women's suffrage and the welfare of women. And so she was appointed in 1888 to the, and actually you can ask me about this and then I can tell you back, or whatever you want to do about it. She was appointed to the Resolutions Committee of the Women's Suffrage Movement here in Omaha. And she would also, she was very much concerned about the treatment of women, and would often show up in court if she felt that women were not being treated fairly in court, which I thought was really kind of interesting. She donated heavily to the Visiting Nurse Association, the Red Cross, the Salvation Army, the YWCA, and to Brownell Hall, where her adopted daughter went, and is a girls' school right over. It's now Brownell Talbot School. They both were great animal lovers, and had horses, Signal Light and Bay. What was that horse's name? Bay Chief, Signal Light and Bay Chief, which were on the property in the house, or the building behind the castle, was the carriage house where the horses lived. They also had several dogs, including the most famous one, who was Madame Modjeska, named after an opera singer. And he was a Saint Bernard. And in the castle is, have you ever been in the castle?
Yes, we did take the tour.
Good, okay. Did you see the marble drinking fountain for the dog? Okay, yes, okay. Well, that was for Madame Modjeska. They also helped to start the Humane Society with a $50,000 gift, which now is probably about $800,000, which they forgave in their wills. They gave 100 acres to Fontenelle Forest to start it. They helped designate. Now this I'm very interested in. Are you native Omahans?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. You know Fontenelle, or Forest Lawn Cemetery?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, okay. I don't know this. I mean, this is apparently what Penelope found out for me. They helped designate Forest Lawn, she helped designate Forest Lawn Cemetery as a wildlife sanctuary. Now, our family is up there with the Joslins. And I never knew that that was a wildlife sanctuary, but I think that's something that people might be interested in knowing. And then the police chief, because of all of her work with the animals and the Humane Society and all, designated her a Humane Society officer and gave her badge number 1. and she investigated the treatment of work animals. Now, isn't this, I mean, it just goes on and on and on and on. She also was a heavy supporter of a founder of the American Board, or the Omaha Board of Charities, and she was an early investor in Exarban, and the Unitarian Church and St. Barnabas Church, which is the little church across the street. And then in the humanities, of course, for which she probably is the most famous, she donated the land across 40th Street, where the community playhouse then was, but it used to be the pasture for the animals on the property. She donated that at 48th and Davenport and, quote, sold it to them, and then retired the debt of $1 million in her will, which I thought was really quite nice of her. But when I was growing up, the community playhouse was at 40th and Davenport. It outgrew itself, and they built it over here, of course. And now I think there's an apartment building there. And she sold tickets and raised funds for all kinds of music groups. And then, of course, in the music room in the castle, she had an organ, and they had organ recitals. And actually, my husband's mother was an organist and played in some of those recitals. Unbelievable. But her greatest cultural gift, of course, was the Joslyn Art Museum, which was supposed to be the Joslyn Memorial, but of course it became the Joslyn Art Museum. And it was begun in 1928 and finished in 31. And she stood in line with everybody else to get in and refused to be on the stage at the time. What else did I find out about it? Oh, and her final bequest, when she died, of course, was for $7 million, which is now about $120 million, to maintain the memorial for George. Imagine having that kind of money. And then I was going to make a statement as to what, this is actually Penelope's statement, as to her. So I'll read that at the end. Now, if you want to go from there and ask, I'll try and.
All right.
Okay, that's awesome. And I think we should probably verbally introduce ourselves. I am Scarlett Clemens, and my fellow interviewer is
Tricia Anderson.
Okay.
And today we are interviewing
Lannie McNichols.
on the topic of Sarah Joslyn and her effects in Omaha. Okay. And
Well, I was very curious because when we did the tour, they were such animal lovers. They have horses engraved in some of the windows.
That's Bay Chief and Signal Light, the two
Right.
horses in the carriage house.
Do you know which animals were their favorite? Was it the horses or was it their dog? 'Cause
Oh, I
they've
haven't
got
any
so
idea. I think
many.
they loved their horses, of course. And there's a wonderful picture in the living room of them on their horses.
Yes, we saw that. I loved the.
Yeah.
I loved that castle. So that was so interesting to me.
It is. It's and of course the carriage house was wonderful. And then Rogers, who was the chauffeur, they had a Pierce Arrow and an electric car and all these various different things, plus of course things that horses would pull. And they all were in the carriage house, and then Rogers and his family lived upstairs.
Oh, okay.
so, do we know very much at all about Sarah's upbringing and how she was raised?
Not a great deal. She and George actually were half first cousins or something or other. Their grandfather had 3 wives, and they were born of different wives. And she was born in 1851 in Vermont and died here at the castle in 1940. And they moved after their marriage in Vermont to Montreal, where he was working with some relatives. And they had their only natural child, Clifton Howard, who is buried in Montreal. He died apparently in the cholera epidemic in Montreal. And they then moved to Des Moines, Iowa for about a year to work in some sort of newspaper organization, and then were given the opportunity to work for the Western Newspaper Union in Omaha, and arrived in 1880. And the story is, between them, they had $9.
Wow.
They then, of course, as time went along and they became more wealthy, one of the things that she did was to entertain children. She loved children at various events, including lemonade parties on the lawn at the castle. And one day she spotted a little girl named Violet Carroll, who apparently, I believe, was from Council Bluffs, who did not have a mother and father or whatever. And so they adopted Violet and raised her in the castle, and she attended Brownell Hall and married David McGowan in 1913. Yes, 1913. And George, and then they had twin daughters, Sarah and Jocelyn, also referred to as Sally and Jossie, in 1915. And then George died in 1916, and Mrs. Jocelyn, Sarah, lived on until 1940. But the girls were raised in the East, in Scarsdale, New York.
Do you know if Sarah suffered from any type of anxiety or traumatic experience after they lost their son?
Not really much is known about that. I think probably, obviously, if you lost your 3-year-old to a cholera epidemic, but there were so many who died in that epidemic that I suppose everybody was in shock.
Yeah. That's got to be shocking.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I couldn't imagine.
Well, there was one account where so many died that they were actually in mass graves, but apparently Clifton's in a regular grave in Montreal.
Okay.
So you mentioned when they first started out in Omaha, they had about $9 between them.
The story is that they had $9 between them when they arrived in Omaha. They lived down on about 20th Street, which is a very nice area at the time. And I think it's now under the interstate or something. Yeah. And then they bought the Sutphen Farm. They were out riding one day and bought the Sutphen Farm, or found it, at 40th and Davenport, which was the outskirts of Omaha, and decided to buy that. And then they lived in the Sutphen Farmhouse, which is actually more on Davenport Street, while they built the castle behind it and the carriage house.
So how, I suppose, did they come up from that poverty and end up building their paper business? How did they get to the point where...
Well, he was working for the Western Newspaper Union, and it was a stockholder's ownership. And as he accumulated money, he would buy more and more stock. I think what he did is a boilerplate newspaper, and I'm not really very sure about all of this, but if you know what the USA Today newspaper is, it's like that. Everybody would have a national newspaper, and then his insert would be all the local news, so it would look like it was, a really big town newspaper. And he did that for all kinds of little towns, so that little town would have a national newspaper plus this insert, and he became very, very wealthy, obviously. In fact, he died the wealthiest man in Nebraska.
Oh, and what impact did Sarah have on that business? Did she have anything to do with the paper business, or was she more just at home?
To my knowledge, no. She was, at home. She had, innumerable servants, and we do have her journal, which showed up in an antique store, and when we were doing the Symphony Show House in the castle. And we retrieved it, and we know how many cut glass wine glasses she had and how many lampshades and everything. We have a great deal of information about but if you have 19 rooms, you have a lot of work to do.
Oh, yeah.
Definitely. How often would she give back to the community? Do you know that?
I think she probably did it on a daily basis. I think she was busy all the time. I know that a Churchill relation of mine's father was one of her doctors, and he would go up on Sunday mornings and meet her in the morning room and talk to her. So that apparently was when she was available, I guess.
Wow.
So what organizations in Omaha did she support? I know you mentioned the Child Saving Institute and the Nebraska Humane Society. What others were there that she supported during her lifetime?
Well, I had a list as long as my arm, as I told you. She was very much interested in education, of course, and so the Omaha University at the time was just getting started, and they did help establish it on Reddick Street, and gave them property at 13th and Farnham, which would provide rental income to them. They supported the Piney Woods School in Jackson, Mississippi, which was a school for black youth. They supported Brownell Hall, where, well, for girls' school, for their daughter Violet, their adopted daughter Violet. I've forgotten whatever else. But anyway, there were a number of educational institutions, and as I say, the amount of money was quite phenomenal. What was my note on that? How much it was now worth? $200,000 or something on that order, and it's quite remarkable that they both.
Yeah.
But her philosophy was, at George's death, they said, "Are you going to move to California?" She had friends in California, and they had visited out there a number of times. But her philosophy was, and she was very frank about it, she said, "The money was made in Omaha, and it will be spent in Omaha." And that's exactly what she did from 1916 to 1940. She spent it and spent it and spent it. But of course, it was also incoming, so she could continue to do so. I've forgotten any other educational places that.
When she started the museum after his passing, was there a board set up, or was it just?
Well, in the first place, it was a mystery. They didn't tell anybody what this was. They bought the block, and Central High School was there because it had been the territorial capital. But then they bought that entire, and nobody knew what they were building, which I thought was terribly funny. And there was always great, speculation about it. And then, yes, as of course it was finished, then, but it was supposed to be to feed the spirit of people, and art and music and all kinds of humanities, theater, etc. There is the Witherspoon Hall, of course, that has a nice stage. So that was feeding the spirit of people, as well as education, of course.
Okay.
So coming up from being very poor and starting out with very little money, how was she able to integrate herself into the society of the richer folks in Omaha once she and George established that amount of money?
Well, as I say, she was very much into the welfare of women and women's suffrage, and in 1888, so they had been here 8 years, she was appointed to the board of the convention or whatever it was that the suffragettes had. That's very early. There was another indication, and I've forgotten where it was exactly, of something she was doing in 1887. So it didn't take her long.
And she worked with the suffragists that whole time up until women got the vote?
Oh, I suppose she did, yeah, because there are pictures of her in, meetings and that sort of thing. And then when she was working with the veterans, veterans and soldiers, there are pictures of her working with the Red Cross and, down at the train station and that sort of thing. So, yeah, I don't know when she had time to sleep. She really was so involved in so many things. But I suppose if you didn't have to do your own dusting, that you had more time.
Right.
So speaking of that, how were her household duties? What would she have been expected to do or have to do as far as taking care of the house and the servants and the animals went?
Well, it's there is the morning room. As you come in the front door on the right is the morning room. And that's where she would be each morning, where her orchid window is. And she would then plan the menus with the housekeeper and various different things, and who is doing what and when. And she had a number of servants in the house, plus those who were not in the house. And at that time, there was a gatekeeper's cottage down east on Davenport Street. So there were quite a number of servants, and of course she was responsible for them. Some were personal servants, some were cleaners, some were. But apparently none of them could be married except the gatekeeper and the chauffeur, who had their own quarters.
Do you know why that was?
Because that was tradition. You didn't have household help that was married. Most of them you know, later on would go home at night kind of thing. But these people stayed on the property.
Okay.
And what impact do you think that she had on her servants and their life? Did she do any acts of charitableness or kindness to them?
Well, I'm sure that she did. And the girls, the twins, the granddaughters, would tell about coming back from, I don't know, some sort of Walt Disney type thing, and they'd dance around with Grandma, whom they called, I can't remember what they called her, Margrave or something or other, some strange name. But anyway, and then they seemed to have these servants. Life was very different then. When I had Sally and Jossie here, we had a question about a dumb waiter into the kitchen and where did it come up, upstairs, etc. Neither one of the girls had ever been in the kitchen. If you noticed in the castle, there is a door by the dining room, and behind that door is the kitchen and all the pantries and all of that, and the second floor is behind there are the housekeeper's room and various different things. And apparently the family stayed up here, and of course the main staircase was for the family, and then the servants' staircase came down behind that door, and that's the way you lived if you had that kind of a house.
Yeah, I know there's a lot of houses in the area down there that were of a similar build.
Yeah, well, that's the way it was. And as I say, the girls laughed about it. They said, we just never went to the kitchen. We don't know where the dumbwaiter was. I mean, they were Vassar graduates. They're not silly people, but they just never went to the kitchen.
Does their family still live on the East Coast?
Well, that's what started the whole thing with me, anyway, because I was with Landmarks, and we were trying to save the post office and do all kinds of things. But anyway, while I was with Landmarks, or on the board, we got a letter, or the school district had the castle, and the school district got a letter from a young man in Florida saying, what's happening to my grandmother's house, great-grandmother's house, because we hear that it's maybe for sale or something. And so the school board called Landmarks and said, who is this person and what are we going to do? And it turned out to be Jossie's son. And of course, we didn't even know about all of these people, so guess who was elected to call up Jossie? And I said, I don't even know this. And she said, I know, just call her up. So I called her up. And I said, I'm Lannie McNichols from Omaha, Nebraska. And she said, oh, my dear. And she went on and on. And I thought, this is just wonderful. So then, of course, we began to find all these people that we had no idea. We thought when they were gone, they were gone. They weren't.
They lived on. Wow.
Yes. Mm-hmm. So Sally had a daughter. I don't remember whether she had, but she had a daughter whose name was also Jocelyn, but they called her Lynn. And then Jossie and Earl had 2 boys. And then they adopted, wait a minute, and then George and Sarah, no. Then Violet and David, the adopted daughter and her husband, adopted David from the Child Saving Institute. So they have a lot of ties to the Child Saving Institute. And David was here too. And he lived on a houseboat in California, and he was great fun. He'd been some sort of flyer in the Second World War, and he was really great fun.
That is wonderful. I remember you mentioned a little bit earlier on about World War I and things that she did with the soldiers to help them. Would you elaborate a bit more? Yeah,
there's an entrance to the basement by the back steps that go up to the kitchen. And through that door, there was a bowling alley and a game room and a smoking room and a card room. I've forgotten what all down there. They've long since gone, of course. And so she opened that up to the enlisted men in Omaha and provided them transportation and entertainment and, food and, I suppose, pop or whatever. Anyway, because she wanted them to have a place to be and to go. And then, as I say, she was interested also in the Liberty bonds, which I'm sure was raising money for the war, and also in the European relief after the war. the Great War that was never going to happen again, and then also the disabled veterans. So, not to my knowledge, nobody has served in the Army or anything, but I don't know that.
Okay.
Let's see.
When we took our tour of the castle, our tour guide mentioned that Sarah was a very practical woman who would wear
Oh
things
my,
that
yes.
were sometimes
Oh
out of
my,
fashion.
yes.
Mhm.
And my mother lived down the street from the castle. And they were not friends of the Joslins by any matter of means, but she did see her a great deal. And she said as she grew older, she used to wear a lot of black dresses after his death. And you know how black turns kind of brown when it gets a little old. And she said most of her dresses were that kind of funny brown that used to be black. And she said once in a while you'd see her and she'd have a note pinned on her to remind her to do something. But it worked.
So do you think that personality characteristic that she had of being more practical, do you think that contributed at all to the personality of the city of Omaha?
Well, I think she was a very conservative woman, yes. Yeah, I mean, she absolutely was not raised with that kind of money, and she was very careful about her money and how she spent it and whom she gave it to. In this statement that Penelope made, she really was very much concerned about everything, but she also swore her beneficiaries, for most of them anyway, to secrecy. She just wasn't seeking any kind of rewards for it.
You mentioned the resolutions committee.
Yeah, for the suffragettes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Could you expand more on that?
I don't really know very much about it. I think probably if they have a resolutions committee, they must have had just state committees or something or other, because obviously the suffragette movement, or the suffrage movement, would have had national resolutions. So what worked in Nebraska didn't work in Massachusetts or something, I have no idea. But that's in part of her history, that she was appointed in 1888 to this resolutions committee.
And do you know if she was politically active in any other way aside from
No, I don't know that.
Okay.
I don't know that. I think they had a lot of political friends. And according to the write-up, and it's on the internet, of Violet's wedding, there were all kinds of political people invited to this wedding. But to my knowledge, I don't know. Maybe George was, I don't know.
Was it customary for women to kind of take the back seat when it came to political, aside from the suffrage movement?
Well, of course, they couldn't vote, so...
There was no way they could
Well, maybe they
say
were
up
underground.
until-
I don't know. I would have been sneaking around doing something or other. And maybe Sarah was. I don't know. I mean, if I have some relationship with her, I guess maybe she was sneaking around too. But yeah, they were fighting for the vote. And when did they get it? In 19 or something?
1920.
Yep.
Was it 20? I thought it was 1919, but whatever. Yeah, they finally won.
Thank goodness.
Yes.
Absolutely. That would be none of us able to vote.
Right.
We'll now go out and vote when we're through with this.
Do you know if the stock market crash had any impact on Sarah?
I think the crash in '93 slowed the business down considerably. But by that time they had built the no, they really had planned the castle. John MacDonald was the architect for the castle and for a number of houses, including our house. And the Unitarian Church, which is that wonderful New England-looking church down on Turner Boulevard in Harney or whatever it is. It's just a wonderful church. But anyway, the Joslins and John MacDonald met in Montreal, and then both came to here. And I think the crash slowed the newspaper business down because they didn't actually build the castle until 1903.
Okay.
And then in 1906 they added the music room and enclosed that part of the front porch that is now the south end of the living room or the library.
Okay.
And we noticed and we heard a little bit about when we were taking our tour of the castle, the Scottish and French aspects of the design, does that have anything to do with their heritage, or is it more the heritage of the architect?
I can't tell you that. I've been told by someone who is an architect, and I am not, that there is no such thing really as a Scottish baronial castle. But that's what this is a Scottish baronial. And if you notice the thistle windows on the staircase at all, I think part of it was inspired by a place called Lyndhurst in, well, it's outside of New York City, it's upstate New York. And they were much inspired by that, and that's why they have a, quote, Scottish baronial castle, but it isn't. And they named their, what was the name of Linwood or something, I can't remember. Anyway, it promptly became the Joslin Castle and never was called Linwood or whatever it was. Isn't that funny? I can't remember the name of it. But it's like the Joslin Memorial. It promptly became the Joslin Art Museum, so you just can't control that.
Yeah. And the tornado that did some damage
Oh,
to their
well, that
estate?
was terrible. In 1913, and my mother grew up in a kind of big, square, wonderful house on 42nd and Davenport. And at 42nd and Dodge, there was a huge, big, tall wall of, I don't know, earth or rock or whatever it was. And Mother said that I think she was 10 when the tornado hit, but it was Easter Sunday, and Mother said everything was kind of mustard color. And then this thing came across from, well, what is now the Med Center, and hit that wall and missed Mother's house and hit the castle. It just bounced right over and hit, and it destroyed the Palm House, which was would be the northwest corner of the property. They had a beautiful palm house, and she had orchids in it and everything, and it was a greenhouse, and it was destroyed. And parts of it remain in that annex at the back. Tremendous damage, and of course the trees and everything. And Violet was to be married in October of 13, and this thing hit on Easter Sunday, and the place was a wreck. And the Joslins knew that they weren't going to live forever, so they had trees and all kinds of, mature plantings put in so that the place would look nice for Joslin. I mean, how awful it must have been. But Jossie said that she and her intended were out walking when this thing hit. And they were married in, 13? Yeah. Yes, Jossie. Okay, well, whatever. Her mother told her that Tilly was one of the indoor maids and the personal maids or something, and there's a glass door, or glass window in the door to the porte cochere, and that Violet the daughter, and David were out walking, and this storm came, and they ran into the porte cochere and hit against this door under the porte cochere with all the rain and the wind and everything. And that they could see Tilly coming to get them through this glass, and that she had glass, in her face and everything, not seriously, but she was cut by flying glass and everything. It was just an awful thing. But they all survived, and they had the wedding and everything. But, oh dear, it must have been just terrible.
Yeah, that would have been terrifying.
The only thing Mother's house lost was the garden house, just, one of those things that you won't sit in the summertime, I guess, or something. But it hit that wall and bounced. And when we're through talking about that, I'll tell you about the Med Center and what it did there.
Okay. And on a bit of a lighter note, I guess, you mentioned orchids and animals a lot. Is there anything else maybe that Sarah was passionate about that we know of?
Well, did we cover most of them?
There were so many.
Yes, that's why I had to have
So
notes. I
many
just
things.
absolutely could not remember all of these things. What did I do with them? We talked about Penelope. What is this? And we talked about the humanities and all of her interests. And we talked about the extra places that she donated it to, and the animals, and the suffragists, and the World War. I think we've just about covered the waterfront. Education. All right. I think that about takes care of it, don't you?
Yeah.
Child care. But I thought that it was a very interesting, if I can find it, statement that Penelope made, because it really covers everything that she was so much into. If you have other questions.
I don't have any more questions. You covered a lot of them.
Yeah, absolutely. You covered so many.
Well, if I can read this, having just had my eyes checked. Like her husband George, Sarah swore most of her beneficiaries to secrecy. Her idea of good meant good for all people. She believed in making the world better, a better place for all living creatures. She looked at her, I can't even read this. She looked at her community on a daily basis and asked, are they treated well? Do they have a place to live, clothes to wear on their backs, shoes to wear? Do they have schools, and do they have something to eat, and do they have something to feed their spirit?
Wow.
And I think she covered the waterfront on that.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Who wrote that?
Penelope Smith
Okay.
is the archivist. So, and I just thought that was a marvelous statement. I'm sorry I didn't read it very well, but.
Oh, no,
No.
we're fine. Again, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate you taking the time to do this.
Oh, no,
with
it
us.
was
You know,
fun
you're so
looking
busy.
back at all of this. It just was a very busy day, as it turned out to be.